Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer and today I'm talking about the International Booker Prize. Ooh, he's really moving out of his comfort zone here. So the International Booker Prize has released its shortlist and is now about to announce its winner. And we have 6 books to talk about from this. And in much the same vein as me talking about the shortlists of the non-international, there needs to be a better name. Also, international is technically a bit of a misnomer here, because technically a UK author who writes in another language could be considered for this. So international is basically not in English. In translation, I guess. International is an easier name. Anyway, the International Booker Prize. And so we've got these 6 books. I've only just finished them. And also apologies for the slightly sweaty, attacked by the sunlight kind of look. That's just me in every month from about late April to about September. I am not very good in the heat, and so attract it very, very quickly, and also just look like I've been attacked quite regularly. Anyway, so let's get on. So these 6 books here. Now, this is a really interesting shortlist overall, because really there is only, I would maybe say, 1 book that falls into the sort of quote unquote typical novel style. Now, in the non-international Booker Prize, there is, it's normally very, very driven by novels. For example, short stories aren't allowed. Collections of short stories aren't allowed anymore. There was one that got shortlisted ages ago, but they're not allowed for it technically. Apart from a few kind of curveballs here and there, they tend to be novels written in a fairly traditional narrative structure and all that kind of stuff. And this International Booker Prize is really exciting for the way that it has completely thrown out that kind of rule book. I think the rule book is slightly different for the international one. Short stories are explicitly mentioned as things that are in it, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm going to stop babbling and I'll start talking about the books. So the first of them, going alphabetically from the names of the authors, is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. So this is a really interesting novel, very, very short. Many of these books actually are very short, with the exception of one on the shortlist. Everything is under 200 pages, a few way shorter than that. It's only about 150 pages is this book, and this is all about these 2 Senegalese soldiers fighting during the Great War. And it is so interesting because it begins with these really gruesome, sort of grisly kind of depictions of war and of, these sort of soldiers torn limb from limb, and kind of, it's graphic and it's grim, but there's something so beautiful about this book. In the way that this man sort of reconciles the kind of relationship he's had with this sort of brother figure who has sort of been wounded, and this, essentially his brother, or how he sees him as his brother, is telling him to kill him and to put him out of his misery because his guts are leaking out everywhere, and yeah. But it's really interesting how it then takes it to the next level, because it could stay there and that would still have been a very good book, I think. But what it does next is really quite interesting. He starts really reflecting on his sort of Senegalese sort of culture and history, and how actually, because he is seen as an outsider, for example, when he appears carrying the body of his sort of brother, people around him kind of think that he's sort of doing some kind of witch doctor kind of spell, or there's something kind of magic or whatever going on. And it's really interesting because then as a result he's kind of left alone, but then he also kind of has all these moments of kind of thinking back to moments of tenderness and softness. So he looks back to this woman who he sort of started going out with and had sex with just before he left to go to the front line. And it's just really quite beautiful because over a really short amount of pages, and I say it's 150 pages, but that is also including, for example, the fact that every chapter begins with like more than half a page, kind of taking up the number, and normally a free page before that. So this is really quite a short book. And I mean, I kind of gulped this up in sort of a bit over, probably just under 2 hours. And it's really interesting as well for something else which I think is really clever. There are a couple of sort of recurring phrases that when they first sort of start coming up, you're like, okay, is this sort of just a bit of a vernacular of this character? And partly that is the case. But what I thought was just so interesting about that is how, you know, so God's truth, for example, is one of them. Every time, pretty much every time he mentions no man's land, he talks about, he gives the French word for it, the French phrase for it, and then kind of translates it into English, but in a way that makes him sound like he's not really sure. And there are quite a few of those little moments sort of peppered throughout. And for me, that really took this book up a notch, because it felt very, it kind of felt almost like this character has, this sort of main central character is so nullified by war, or not nullified, numbed by war, or so kind of shaken up, that he kind of is almost repeating these phrases, sort of comfort blankets, or they're kind of interrupting thoughts. And I found that really quite captivating, and particularly in a book this short, those kind of little hooks are really quite interesting. I will say a couple of parts of this, you know, when he sort of starts having sort of recollections of back home, did feel a little bit kind of tacked on in some parts, of sort of, okay, now we're going to get 20 pages about my life back home. But I mean, I'm willing to overlook that, because I just thought this book was so beautiful in so many ways. I keep on looking at it as I'm doing it, like very adoringly, like, yes, David Diop, that was it. And I thought it was really interesting as well, because actually on the shortlist, this is probably the closest to a traditional novel on there. As I'll talk about with the other shortlisted books, they do not follow sort of traditional narrative structures or kind of novel structures really at all in some cases. So it's a really interesting shortlist for that. Next up, as I mentioned, there are collections of stories in this, and I think there were a couple of others in the long list. But Mariana Enriquez's The Dangers of Smoking in Bed is a short story collection, and it sort of billed as a bit of a horror short story collection, in quite a really interesting way. I mean, I've seen a few mixed reviews about it, and I will agree to that, in the sense that there were some short stories in this that I thought were really strong and really interesting, and some where I was kind of like, okay, so, and I don't know, I have a bit of an odd relationship with short stories, in that there are some, Kafka, whose short stories I adore and will always adore. But I sometimes find it quite hard to really get into short stories. I don't know if it's because because, you know, as a reader, maybe I'm too impatient and I just sort of rush through a short story and then kind of get to the end and be like, huh? Sorry, what? Sometimes I worry that it's because I sort of elongate it and kind of purposely read one short story a day instead of reading the book in kind of totality. Or maybe short stories, I don't know, necessarily aren't for me. But it's weird, because, for example, there were a couple of short stories on this that I really started to enjoy, and then they ended. And I was like, oh, okay. There we go. So that was quite strange for me, I think, in some ways. But I still think, you know, so there's a short story in this all about, for example, a man who starts recording videos of people, and it's kind of quite creepy and quite spooky in the way it's done. And, you know, he sort of, by recording videos, is sort of almost in it's sort of in the underbelly of society. So he's watching people who want to kind of do the most sort of depraved things, or the most sort of secretive things, and he's sort of the passive observer. But then, and then there's a really interesting a part of the story where he starts recording someone who has fits, and it's basically so that he can play this back to this woman afterwards and kind of show her what it's like. But then he decides not to show the footage, and then it ends, and I was like, oh, I don't know. Yeah, so I think that's kind of how I felt with some of this collection. There were quite a few stories where I got to the end of them and I was like, all right, okay, I kind of wanted more. Some where it felt like it finished too abruptly, and then some, I think one of the final ones is sort of about 50 pages long, and I got to the end, and again I was like, oh, I don't know if that needed to be 50 pages, but I don't know, maybe I'm being particularly harsh on this book, I don't know. But I mean, I can definitely see that this is maybe also not a kind of me collection, but is something that would really appeal to a lot of other people. And apart from anything else as well, this cover art is brilliant. And I really that's the thing, I really liked the power of the writing of this. I get the feeling, you know, I unfortunately don't read Spanish yet, but I get the feeling that in the original Spanish, some of these stories would have been incredible, because the way the language is used, at least in the translation, is really quite powerful and incredible. It's just that I don't know if I was sold on the contents of those stories enough. But that said, a worthy, addition to the shortlist. Maybe not the one I'm going to be kind of coming back to afterwards, but still, I think a really powerful little collection. And that takes us to another book that I thought actually I finished it today and didn't realise that how kind of non-typical novel it was. So I was getting to the point where I was I read all the experimental ones first without realising, and the final two were David Diop's At Night All Blood is Black and Benjamin Labatut, and When We Cease to Understand the World. And I for some reason, maybe I just hadn't really read the blurb properly enough, thought this was a fairly typical novel, and then started reading it and realised I was wrong. So it basically charts quite a few sort of scientific figures through history, particularly kind of European ones, particularly around maths and physics. And they're often quite theoretical characters, these sort of, I think all men actually, who have kind of various sort of theories or create things. And so, for example, we start with learning about the man who, I've now forgotten everyone's name despite finishing this book today, but the man who discovered ways of kind of extracting nitrogen from the air and from other parts. Now, he saw that as being a really positive thing for helping make sure that soil could have enough nitrogen and therefore enough food could be created. But that nitrogen was also used to create things like Zyklon B and kind of nervous gases that were used to kill people and, and used in, concentration camps. So he had quite a bizarre look back on his life afterwards. Interestingly, actually, what the book picks up on is how he, at the end of his life, was more annoyed that he'd contributed to overpopulation than perhaps Zyklon B. Anyway, make of that what you will. But I thought it was really interesting as a book, and particularly, we kind of see that, and we see a character. I say characters; these are based on real people, and we then see it really kind of charting the lives of Schrödinger, for example, and his theories, and how various, particularly men, again, around that time, were there were all these sort of mathematical and physics-based discoveries all happening, and people kind of disagreeing with each other and what have you. And he sort of picks out the lives of those people outside of it. So how for many of these people, their lives were so consumed by the pursuit of knowledge and kind of road testing their theories and what have you, and how almost for all of them, their lives suddenly created these other negative consequences. Or, they, in the case of one of the men, I can't remember his name now, was this sort of mathematical genius, but then basically lived like a monk for the end part of his life, and eschewed all sort of maths and everything. And so these lives are really complicated and troubled and what have you, and that's all taking place alongside the backdrop of things like World War II, and sort of there's a mention of a Japanese blogger who this mathematician who posts a blog, and everybody follows his mathematical ideas up until towards the end of his thesis, when everyone suddenly goes like, sorry, what? And that was basically to try and prove A plus B equals C. And it's sort of this really complicated thing, and it kind of goes through. And the thing is, I was getting to sort of towards the end of this book being like, this is fascinating. A little bit confused this is in a fiction prize, but this is fascinating and really well written and charted, because it really feels like we're following a trail of these men. And then suddenly we get to a point where, one of the scientists who was mentioned earlier kind of comes back, and then Einstein is sort of trying to debate some of these characters, and it's really, really interesting. And it sort of feels like this kind of fictionalized biography science thing that's really effective. And then suddenly this book pulls this really interesting bait and switch in the last sort of 20 or 30 pages, where it suddenly basically flips to being fiction, or at least sort of something like autofiction. And for me, this is where this book went from good to great, because I was following the kind of sciencey bits and thought it was really interesting, and was kind of thinking, okay, yeah, there's some cool stuff here. And then suddenly this book decides to take a personal approach. And for a little while, you're not quite sure what's happening, because the switch to I feels quite alarming almost after all of that. And then we get this story, you know, the last section is called something like The Night Gardener. And it's this man tending his garden with these sort of lemon trees. And suddenly little kind of echoes of these men appear in the narrative. So, for example, there's something about nitrogen, and this brings on the idea about the man who inadvertently sort of led to the creation of Zyklon B. And then you've got a sort of reference to other bits of science. And then there's this beautiful image towards the end, and I don't want to spoil it, but this beautiful idea of a lemon tree, and what lemon is sort of in their final bursts. Lemon trees basically they basically do one final sort of song and dance almost when the tree knows it's about to die. So it will kind of suddenly sprout lots of lemons all at once, so that it basically dies while sort of propagating. So it gets so heavy with all of these lemons that all of the branches fall off, and basically that allows the tree to start rotting, but also it means that you've got all these lemons around and all these seeds to grow the next set of trees. And there's something so beautiful about the way that the book throws in that right towards the end, after we've really followed these scientists and mathematicians who've had these really troubled lives. And there is this kind of parallel being drawn there of their final sort of burst of genius, or their final work going out into the world, and then they sort of take their final bow. I will sort of say that I can see how this book might be quite off-putting to people. There are sort of a few moments where I was like, again, okay, and where are we going with this? But I did sort of enjoy the ride. I was really enjoying following where Labatut was taking us on this ride, and I thought so much was really fascinating about this book. So I would really recommend it. I think maybe this is one of my favourites from the list, and I'm kind of surprised at that, because I'm not quite sure. I was not expecting to really enjoy parts of it as much as I did. I should note, by the way, that Kieran over at KD Books has done a review of all of these books individually and separately, and I would highly recommend checking out his individual reviews for all of these books, because he goes into more detail than I'm going into here, and is funny and interesting to boot. But yeah, it's such an interesting shortlist so far, even with just these 3 books. And I think for the final 3 books on this shortlist, going alphabetically, this is where the kind of experimental-ometer gets turned up a few notches, and it really kind of goes into overdrive and is just such a bizarre ride. First up, alphabetically, if I'm doing my alphabet right, from those 3 is The Employees by Olga Ravn, which was originally in Danish, I believe. And this is sort of billed as a novel, but again, almost doesn't really feel like one at times. So it's all, I'm going to try and find a good page to show you what it kind of looks like. So, for example, it's all done as statements. So we've got statements 69 and 71 there. And these statements are kind of the idea of a future sort of colony or kind of area or kind of world. And yeah, the subtitle of this book is A Workplace Novel of the 22nd Century. This little dinky book is really quite small. What's really interesting is it basically follows the idea of this future life and what it might look like to be working in that. But then it kind of starts going off on these really interesting side narratives. So you've got these characters who are all, you know, sometimes you can't quite tell how, some of these statements feel like they're from similar people, some of them feel like they're from very different people, and everyone's sort of a bit confused about, you know, where they live. They're sort of being distinguished between humans and humanoids, and all these kind of other kind of people and characteristics and what have you that make up this future world. And it's really interesting because it kind of pulls you in, because these little statements are sometimes so cryptic and sometimes so short that you kind of wonder if you've missed something, and particularly because they're numbered sort of sporadically. Like, it's very rare that you actually have a few in direct numerical order. You know, sometimes it'll be a couple of numbers near each other, but then just when you think you've got the hang of that, it will suddenly jump back a bit. And it's interesting. because then you kind of, those bits themselves are really interesting, and then you get to this end section that's a sort of appendix, and sort of a, yeah, kind of, that basically creates this idea of almost like a sci-fi kind of thing of this place being shut down, all the life forms being killed off and everything. And it's weird because you almost feel like these are then the final statements that we've heard of these this sort of group of people before they die, and it's this really interesting snapshot into their lives. But at the same time, it gives you a bit, but kind of pulls back and doesn't give you everything. So you really do want to immediately go and reread it. The only reason I didn't is because I needed to get around to the rest of the shortlist to make this video, and to try and do so before the winner is announced on I believe the 1st of June, no, the 2nd of June. And so yeah, this is just a really interesting book, and I think one that I found such a nice and interesting surprise. It's so short. I mean, you can read it in almost no time at all, because I mean, like I said, some of these statements are, you know, minuscule. You know, some of them are a sentence long, some of them are about 2.5 pages long, and that's about the longest you'll get. And this, I think, originally, if I'm right, accompanied accompanied an art exhibition, a sort of installation, and this book was sort of formed from little kind of statements or excerpts that we use kind of, I believe, across the room to kind of add some sort of context or kind of situational kind of thing to the art exhibit. So really, really interesting. And yeah, again, just this, I've been really enjoying, at least this year. I haven't read too many of the other Booker, international Booker shortlists before. Well, I haven't finished any of them. I've read about half of last year's. But they seem to be a tiny bit more experimental and a little bit more freeform with how they approach books in fiction, than the sort of non-international. I was going to say main Booker Prize, but that, I never really liked that distinction. Anyway, so that's Olga Ravn's The Employees, and then we come to a book that, no word of a lie, is probably about as long as about 3 of the other entries in this. So it's about 500 pages. It's Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory. And for those of you who know Fitzcarraldo Editions, who are a fantastic little publisher, you may notice something straight away, which is this book's cover, which I'm assuming is right here as I'm saying this, is white. And in Fitzcarraldo Editions, let me quickly, here we go. So, minor details. This book, for example, by Fitzcarraldo Editions, made the long list, didn't make the short list. Apparently, I've not read it yet, but is one that loads of people adored. All about a Palestinian woman and kind of a sort of breakdown after sort of war and all of these kinds of things. Now, this, as you may be able to tell, is blue. And Fitzcarraldo put their fiction in blue and their non-fiction, which again I'm hoping is here, in white. In Memory of Memory, as you can see, the front cover is white. This was published as essentially an essay, sort of auto-fiction, but kind of more on the non-fiction side. Kind of more of a biography and an essay on memory in some ways than it is a novel. So it was quite surprising to see this not only make the long list, but then onto the short list. Because essentially, you know, in a book prize sort of shortlist that is normally about fiction, we've got this 500-page book that in many ways reads like a personal essay. It reads kind of in some ways a bit more like, oh gosh, who am I thinking? Sort of almost like in that kind of way that we've had a lot more, like, you know, Roxane Gay kind of style essays, of sort of personal essays that are, Samantha Irby, these kinds of books where these kind of really powerful essays that sort of turned into a book form. And so it's really interesting. This book made it in, and this is kind of what I'm really enjoying about this year's International Booker Prize. It is so left field. I think so many of the books that people expected to make it did not, and instead lots of books that people wouldn't have even realised were eligible are in it. So In Memory of Memory, I will stop rambling about other bits, but In Memory of Memory is, this is Maria Stepanova looking over her sort of family history, in theory, well, technically, but then she goes into very many different areas from it. So she looks back at her family, who are Russian and are Jewish, and she looks at, for example, how, you know, particularly in around World War II and kind of years sort of slightly before and slightly after that wasn't necessarily a great time to be a Jew in Europe, and Russia was also having its own sort of troublesome parts of history, you know, with various sort of revolutions, with sort of you know, things around communism and all of these other things. And so Maria Stepanova basically charts her family history whilst bringing in sort of almost more theoretical discussions about what memory is. So, for example, she looks at things like, she looks at items, and can you pick up these items and really kind of feel a sense of history? And what is interesting about this book is it almost flips it round and does it the other way round. So typically you'd expect a book around memory to perhaps focus way more on the items and to kind of chart it by items. The actual proper evidence, as it were, the hard evidence of letters, of things like that, are included in sections that are called nota chapters, and they are often 2-3 pages long. So actually the evidence is sort of really in the background, and instead this is Maria Stepanova going into a really lengthy and detailed discussion of what it means to be part of a family, what it means to have a lineage of some form, what's carried on from generation to generation, what it means to remember. You know, there are sort of various things where her parents or parts of her family don't want certain stories in there because they're not exactly how they remember them, and she references how her dad especially won't let her print certain bits because it doesn't fit with his memory, or it wouldn't work. It would kind of morph a memory he already had, and he didn't like that. And so this book is just quite a weird, funny little enigma that kind of happens there, and I really enjoyed it overall. But definitely see what people are saying about the length aspect, because for me the first 150 pages of this I thought were just so exquisitely written. I was entirely on board with this book, and then you do have about another 300 pages and it can occasionally feel like, okay, we've circled some of this ground. Interestingly, the International Booker Prize judges, when they spoke about it, spoke about how this book creates its own I'm paraphrasing, but kind of creates its own theories, creates its own narratives. And it does feel like that. It does feel like this book starts, creates an idea of where it's going to go next, goes there, and then in the process creates something new for the next part of it. So the book does keep on feeling like it's evolving. So I see why this book doesn't stop at 200 pages. I know that for some people, including Kieran over at KD Books, maybe stopping it halfway would have made sense. And I do partly agree with that, because it does, after a little while, it feels a tiny bit indulgent. But then also there's something about the growth that this keeps on building throughout the book that is quite impressive and quite beautiful. And so I really enjoyed this. In some ways, I wouldn't be surprised if this is the one that wins. I think it's a bit of a, I don't know if I'm sort of making this up too much, but it does often feel that longer books have a little bit more of a chance with things like rereading, right? Because you reread a book of 150 pages and you reread a book of 500 pages, and you know the judges by this point will have read the shortlisted books 3 times each. And you do start to wonder, actually, a book like In Memory of Memory has so much more, in theory, to give you time after time than something like that, in theory, than a 120-page book or what have you. And so I think it's really interesting because this book has a lot of kind of gems and kind of really beautiful moments in it that I just thought was stunning, with just this idea of how memory is this big, we kind of always want to pin it down and think that memories are these fixed things, or that we're really excited about the memories we're going to pass on to our children. And often, these things are kind of very different. I mean, even, for example, as I mentioned, this book in some ways deals with bits of European history, but it also purposely avoids talking about it. Maria Stepanova talks about how it's sort of almost quite bizarre and kind of interesting that, pogroms are happening in Russia, there's the Holocaust, and kind of concentration camps, and yet her family, not really that many people that she knows of, went to a concentration camp, and then her family largely kind of were able to escape some of the worst parts of other things happening. And so her family in some ways, this idea of her family's memory seems to jar with the memory of the public or the memory of history books, because they will talk about these big events happening in Russia or across other parts of Europe at that time, and her family is thinking almost more about heirlooms that are passed down, or thinking about this little story about when somebody went ice skating. Well, you know, it's really quite fascinating for that. So this is a really interesting book, and I part of me does want to reread it, but also part of me wants a bit of a break before I do so, because it is quite long and it's quite full on in some ways. But a really interesting addition to this list, especially as it is probably of all of these the furthest, well, maybe not given the next book, but one of the furthest away from the title of fiction in this whole selection. And finally, we come to the book that's probably the most, I mean, controversial is maybe a weird word for it, but is the book that I think has had the most confusion around, perhaps, and that is The War of the Poor by Eric Vuillard. And this book, originally in French, is about something like 60 or 70 pages long. It is sort of ostensibly talking about this kind of one radical character who sort of fought against the church and was sort of trying to establish these free sort of Gutenberg presses to kind of get the message out, this kind of Lutheran, I think, message. And it's interesting. I think something that, again, Kieran over at KD Books said that I hadn't thought of when I read this book, was that in some ways the length and sort of format of this book are meant to kind of fit something here, because this character, and again, I really should know his name, the kind of at the heart of it, his whole thing is, you know, he creates these pamphlets, these kind of radical, revolutionary pamphlets that kind of get people riled up and get them thinking about different things, especially with regards to the church or what have you. And the book itself almost then feels like a pamphlet. And I hadn't sort of picked up on that connection, but Kieran does so really, really well over on his channel. I think, I mean, we both gave it essentially the same rating, which I sort of gave it around 3 stars out of 5, which I know seems like fairly okay, depending on your star rating. That 3 is quite low for me. I'm basically very happy and very pleased by most things. So most books get 4 or above. I say 4 or above like they're that many above. 4 or 5 stars. But this was sort of a 3, potentially a 2. Eric over at Lonesome Reader described it as feeling like an elongated Wikipedia entry. And I agree, in the sense that it feels very much like it talks about historical information around this man. And only occasionally do we get things that feel like there's sort of something authorial or some kind of narration going on, because, for example, many of the details are presented fairly factually, and we almost don't get the addition of an author in the background saying, you know, giving us a sort of sense of judgment, or, you know, kind of saying that this was a really incendiary or exciting moment. We kind of get that reported fairly factually, and it's only sort of towards the end that we get these little flashes of the sort of passion and the kind of emotion behind this character, who was, again, a real person. But for me, that almost felt a bit too late, because by that point I sort of was just thinking like, oh, we're here, okay. And I don't know, I found it really hard to, yeah. I think, as many people, I sort of been fairly confused by it. I think especially the thing that's probably annoyed most people, I think if this had made the shortlist and Minor Detail by Adania Shibli had also made it, I think balance would have been restored in the world somewhat. I think people would have been kind of okay with a bit more of a wild card. But I think it's, for example, the fact that this is a bit of a wild card that, to judge by its Goodreads reviews, very, very few people have put kind of in the sort of 4 or 5 star category. You know, 3, 2, 1 seem to be where this book is sort of residing. And it does seem quite weird to have a book that is so out there that very few people seem to be raving about, apart from the judges. And that's always, I guess, the difficulty with a book prize, right? Judges may love something, it may not be beloved by everybody else. But I think that's maybe where also some of the frustration is, that it feels like there are books that have missed out, but it also does feel like there is a book that has made it that people are a bit confused about. Anyway, so that's The War of the Poor, the more kind of controversial one from this whole setup. What was I going with that? Anyway, and I completely got lost in my thoughts there by War of the Poor. And that brings us to the end of all of our 6 shortlisted books. Now, with the announcement of the winner being kind of coming on Wednesday, I'm really intrigued to see which of these take it away. So my personal favourite, if I had to choose, I would go for either At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, because I just think this book is stunning, or Benjamin Labatut with When We Cease to Understand the World, because I think both of these books, whilst being incredibly short, do incredible, interesting things with fiction and with the page and with language, and kind of sort of throw spanners in the works of various forms of fiction. So this book, At Night All Blood is Black, takes the idea of a sort of war story, and it does something quite new with it. We don't often get the perspectives of people like, for example, Senegalese warriors fighting for France. We don't often get that kind of story. Equally, When We Cease to Understand the World does really fascinating things with blending fiction and non-fiction in what I think is a really powerful way. You've also got books on there like The Employees by Olga Ravn that I just think do something quite exciting. I would be quite surprised if this won, just because I think it's a little bit more... I think you're a little bit more distant from this book by the very nature of it. And I think, therefore, it might be a bit harder to kind of fully win round people to kind of being like, yes, this is the book of the year. But all of that said, I would not be surprised at all if In Memory of Memory took the prize. I kind of think a book like that is so interesting and so special, and does such interesting things, that I really wouldn't be surprised if it made it. But yeah, I'm rooting for When We Cease to Understand the World and At Night All Blood is Black. Anyway, here's now where I get proven completely wrong, and it's The War of the Poor that wins. But I'd love to know your thoughts. What books from the shortlist have you really enjoyed? What ones are you rooting for? And I guess we'll see next Wednesday. I'm probably going to record a short kind of reaction at some point to the winner, because I'm intrigued to see what actually does happen with it. But here we go. Fingers crossed for At Night All Blood is Black. Anyway, take care, and I hope you are doing really, really well. Bye-bye.